Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. We are back for another live stream, third in 2 days, but it is very much warranted, and we have a very special guest I'm going to introduce to you all in a minute. But before I do, please hit the like button. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. Please hit the subscribe button if you are new to the channel. Also hit that notifications bell so you know when we go live, or at least have a chance to be notified. And of course, go to the video description to find all the places where you can support this work: Patreon, Substack, and many other options. I want to thank all the moderators who are here tonight, as well as all of the viewers, all of the YouTube members who may be here as well. We are going to get right started because it's a very momentous time. October has been a historic month in many respects, and it is ending with what seems to be a pretty big bang. So there's no better person to talk about the geopolitical and geoeconomic developments occurring right now than BEN NORTON. BEN NORTON is the host, and he is the founder of Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, thanks so much for coming back on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Danny.
Of course, of course. Well, October has been quite the month. As we speak right now, there are numerous reports from Axios, Al Monitor, of Israel, and I know you want to get into this, Israel's retaliatory, that's how it's being framed across the Western mainstream media, retaliatory strikes on Iran. Now, there were explosions throughout October 20, I believe it's October 26th, actually, in Iran. Explosions near the defense ministry, supposedly, explosions across the country. And then there started to be reports about Israel conducting strikes. The IDF has said they are conducting strikes right now. Iran is saying that one of these strikes are very limited. They are combating them through their air defenses. And it seems that the U.S. is admitting to, and Israel, that this is all about hitting quote unquote military targets. So, Ben, given that there has been almost like a holding of a breath by much of the world about the future of a Israel-Iran war, and of course the United States' role, which the U.S. was sending F-16s to CENTCOM to send to Israel. Supposedly another THAAD system is going there, a second one, in order to bolster Israel's defenses. Talk about your assessment of this situation. It seems like, this is not only a major development, a very dangerous one, but also I think says a lot about where this burgeoning all-out war, a regional war, and global war, where it's all going.
Yeah, well, I should say that we're recording right when the news is breaking. So this is the early morning on the 26th in West Asia, at night in the US and North America. So we don't have a lot of details yet, but what it does seem is that Israel is afraid of escalating further, which is obviously a good sign. It shows that Iran has been able to successfully establish a deterrent. Now, for weeks, the discussion was, will Israel attack nuclear sites in Iran? And Donald Trump was saying Israel should attack nuclear sites. Supposedly, Joe Biden said that he instead wanted Iran not to attack nuclear sites, but instead oil facilities, which is hilarious because this is an act of terror, right? I mean, oil facilities are civilian targets, and it also would be right before the U.S. presidential election. And if Israel were to bomb oil facilities in Iran, cutting off Iran's oil production, it would almost certainly lead to a massive increase in oil prices right before the U.S. election, which would be just a genius master strategy by the Biden White House. So it looks like Israel instead decided that it's only going to hit so-called military targets, which is quite surprising because usually Israel hits civilian targets constantly. But I think this is because Iran successfully showed that it has established a deterrent. It can hit Israel with the attack in which it used around 180 missiles and hit numerous important strategic military sites in Israel, including reportedly the headquarters of Mossad, the Israeli spy agency. So again, we're still speaking very early. It's hard to say exactly what's happening, but it does seem like this attack is not as bombastic, not as big as many people thought it would be. And I think that's a sign of Israeli weakness. The other point to mention, which you kind of obliquely referenced, is this nonsensical framing in the Western media claiming that this is an Israeli retaliatory attack, which, unless you have a time machine, unless you don't understand how history works and how time works, this is not a retaliatory attack. Iran's attack was retaliatory, because let's not forget here, Israel has carried out numerous attacks on Iran over the past year. I mean, of course, going back decades, assassinating Iranian scientists and carrying out attacks inside Iran. But in particular, in the past year, Israel has carried out numerous attacks on Iranian soil. So first of all, in April, Israel bombed Iran's embassy, its consulate in Syria, which was an act of war according to international law. An embassy or a consulate is the national territory of whatever the country is that operates it. And then that was the previous Iranian retaliatory attack against Israel in response to that, the attack that Israel initiated. And then in July, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, in Tehran, in Iran's capital, which was another act of war inside Iranian territory. And then Israel also assassinated a top Iranian general in Lebanon as part of this horrific attack in which it destroyed 6 entire high-rise buildings to try to kill Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. Israel also got less attention, but Israel also killed a major Iranian general. Imagine if Iran killed a major Israeli general, right? It would be all over the news, but when Israel does it, it's not a big deal. And then finally, we saw that Iran responded with the missile attack, 180 missiles. That was a retaliatory attack. And when Iran carried out this attack, they released a statement saying that our attack is legitimate and proportional according to international law. We have a right to defend ourselves. They even cited the UN Charter in the self-defense article. And they said, we have established a deterrent. We're done. We do not want to escalate further. So now Israel is the one escalating. It's by definition not a retaliatory attack. It's actually a new attack, an act of aggression. But the fact that I think it again, we'll see if it escalates further, but it seems like the initial attack was quite limited. So I think that, Israel got the message, and clearly it's not able to, they can see that Iran is a very powerful military force. Iran is quite a large country. And I think Israel has finally been a bit humbled, and it's used to just bombing women and children trapped in a big concentration camp called Gaza. And now that they're actually facing the potential of a war against a very serious adversary, it seems like they've taken a few steps back.
Yeah, that definitely seems like what is happening, and I think you're exactly right. It speaks to changed calculus. The first iteration of Operation True Promise 1, didn't succeed in all respects of establishing deterrence. Israel once again, decided to conduct an assassination inside of Iranian territory, inside of the country, and that was just another red line crossed. And now, according to Al Mayadeen's reports, as we are speaking, Ben, it seems to me that what Iran is saying is that whatever strikes were launched against it or have been launched so far against Iran have been intercepted. And what's so interesting is the U.S. is claiming that it has no involvement in this at all. But all day, as these explosions were being reported in Iran, these mysterious explosions, there were reports about CENTCOM continuing to send supplies, military supplies and armaments to Israel, these F-16s, tankers, all kinds of things going toward this direction. And we also had Antony Blinken rushing to the Middle East in what seems to be not just about restarting Gaza negotiations for electoral purposes, but also to, now that we know that Israel is actively targeting Iran, that there was obviously talks about making sure that this was limited, because as you said, there is an election coming up, and Benjamin Netanyahu said it quite plainly that this was going to happen before November 5th, as if to say, to stick it right in the eye. And there are some who claim that Israel's war maneuvers and war of aggression toward Iran has a lot to do with also weakening the U.S. position, because we've talked a lot about who's wagging the tail here. And I think we're both on the side that the United States indeed has that power, has that ability. But also, that doesn't mean that Israel isn't going to try to pressure the United States with all it has to do what Israel thinks is in its best interests, which it seems to be war on Iran, whether that's correct or not. But Ben, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, a few points there. First of all, we should just think about the different size between Iran and Israel, just for comparison. So we don't know exactly how many soldiers Israel has, but I haven't seen many estimates that go above 200,000, a bit under 200,000, whereas it's widely estimated that Iran's military is nearly 1 million. Iran's population is over 90 million. So, I mean, Israel loves to bluff about how it can take on all of these countries and wage war against all of its neighbors, but they can know basic math, and they can see that 1 million is much larger than 200,000, and it would be a complete disaster. Not to mention the fact that, again, Israel is so used to just bombing women and children trapped in Gaza and fighting against Hamas militants who have very low-level technology, very basic missiles, whereas Iran is a very advanced military, and actually fighting a conventional war is very different. Considering that, I know we're going to talk about Lebanon, and Israeli forces are being devastated by the Lebanese resistance because, again, they're cowards and they're not used to actually fighting, in particular on the ground, against trained combatants. They're used to just bombing women and children in their homes. So the idea that Israel could take on the Iranian military is laughable. I mean, it's just a joke, especially after, in Lebanon, Hezbollah and also Iraqi forces and Iranian forces were hardened in the fight against ISIS. And imagine how brutal it would be to fight against ISIS. I mean, the soldiers and the combatants who were trained in the years of that process, they are more than willing to defend their countries against Israel. Whereas you have all these Israeli soldiers who are complaining because they don't have the right food or whatever, and they're complaining that they don't have vegan boots or whatever. Imagine them fighting. It's just a joke. Like, that's why Israel just constantly resorts to bombing people trapped in their homes. They can go nowhere. Now, to the other point about the U.S. role, it's very clear, largely because the U.S. election is coming up, that the Biden administration has been telling Israel, you cannot escalate this further. Also, because if there's a full-on regional war with Iran, it would be a disaster for you, it would be a disaster for us. And I think what's also fascinating is how, Blinken has spent basically half of the year in Israel. He's taken over a dozen trips to Israel, constantly going back and forth, telling Israel, you have to do this, you have to do that. And Drop Site News, which is a new platform founded by some people who left The Intercept, they published an incredible report from some internal Israeli sources that shows that Blinken has been sitting in on these meetings and giving a green light to Israel, saying, you can attack this, you can attack that, you can't attack that. And Blinken, according to this report, again, citing internal Israeli sources, Blinken approved Israel launching attacks on humanitarian aid trucks. And now we've seen, even the mainstream corporate media has acknowledged in the past few weeks that Israel is not even allowing any of these trucks in anymore after previously bombing them, attacking them. I mean, they're trying to starve Gazans. They're preventing food aid from coming in. But the point is that Blinken is directly complicit, according to this report. And now we know what he's talking about in this over a dozen meetings that he's had, trips he's taken to Israel. He's sitting in with top Israeli officials. He knows what they're doing. I mean, this idea that the Biden administration has that supposedly, it's just all Netanyahu. No, that's nonsense. Everything that Israel is doing, the U.S. knows, not only because Blinken is sitting in these meetings, but come on, let's not be naive. The CIA knows everything that Israel does. We talk about, Mossad's powerful spying abilities, but the CIA definitely has all of these assets. And basically, Mossad is part of the CIA. I mean, Mossad and CIA are part of the same kind of network, international network of terror and espionage and regime change plotting and war. So the US knows all of this. And then, not to mention the fact that the Biden administration has given $18 billion in military aid in 1 year. 17.9 billion is the official number. And that's probably a conservative estimate. It's the official number in just 1 year. I mean, that's absolutely amazing when you think about how much money that is. Now, of course, when you compare it to Ukraine, the US has been spending so many billions and billions of dollars funding all of these wars that we've become desensitized to the amount of money, but it really is shocking. So, of course, the Biden White House, with the election coming up, they clearly told Israel, you can't start a whole-on regional war with Iran. We're going to lose the election. And it seems like Israel did get the message and took a step back. But of course, I don't think it's just because of that. We also talked about how Iran is a very serious adversary. Israel is already losing soldiers in the fight against Lebanese resistance forces, which are much weaker. I mean, they're still very well trained and battle hardened, but compared to the Iranian military, Hezbollah it's a formidable force, but it's not like the Iranian military, which if Israel were ever to fight a war against Iran, probably both sides would be destroyed. I mean, of course, Israel would try to destroy Iran, but it would not go well for Israel either.
No, it wouldn't. And I think your point about the sizes of these militaries is a really good one because I was doing some quick research, and you're exactly right. Iran's military is about 650,000 active, about 350,000 reserve, so equaling 1 million. Then on the Israeli side, according to the Wall Street Journal, it is much smaller. We're talking about 170,000 active at most. The majority, which has come up in the fighting in Gaza, the genocidal campaign in Gaza, the ground campaign, it has come up as being a big problem that they rely mostly on reservists, 4 to 5 times the number of active personnel. That only increases every time they go deeper and deeper into just Gaza alone. So Israel obviously cannot fight some kind of ground game, not to mention the geographic issues that they would have to deal with. But even in this attempt to bomb Iran, which John Bolton, you've written so much about, is always calling for, and it seems like Antony Blinken is helping coordinate where Israel can bomb. Even doing that negates the fact, and Iranian officials have said this over and over, that they have also the ability to shoot down Israeli, not only Israeli strikes, but also Israeli jets if they end up coming into their territory. So it's not an easy war at all, and I think you're right. It would lead to massive destruction on both sides and probably everywhere, because I don't think an Israel-Iran, a U.S.-backed Israel-Iran war could be contained. It's geographically, it makes absolutely no sense. And we've been talking about the axis of resistance a lot, and how any kind of conflict with Iran would only intensify that resistance manyfold. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing constant attacks on the U.S. troops who are illegally occupying Syria by Syrian resistance forces and also by Iraqi resistance forces. There have been attacks on the U.S. troops who are illegally occupying Iraq as well. So just to emphasize those points, this might surprise people who don't know because it's almost never mentioned in the media. The U.S. has been illegally occupying about 1/3 of Syrian territory for years now, including the most oil-rich area that also has a lot of the wheat fields, to try to starve the Syrian government of the oil revenue and food to try to collapse the Syrian economy. This is the stated goal of the United States. Top U.S. officials have admitted that. They want to starve the Syrian government of revenue. And of course, the U.S. also has these devastating criminal sanctions on Syria that violate international law, the so-called Caesar sanctions. And the U.S. is also still occupying Iraq. 20 years after the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq, there are still U.S. troops there. Obama claimed that he ended the war, but the troops never left. And let's not forget that in 2020, Donald Trump assassinated not only Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, but he also, at the same time, assassinated the top Iraqi military commander, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was a leader of the PMF forces that helped to defeat ISIS. So, Qasem Soleimani from Iran, the top general, and al-Muhandis from Iraq, together, these were two of the most important figures in defeating ISIS. And Trump, he thanked them for defeating ISIS by killing them. And then now Biden has backed Israel, which has killed Nasrallah, who also helped to defeat ISIS. These were the three main people who defeated ISIS. Hezbollah, Iraq, and Iran, and their leaders were assassinated. So, and by the way, there was a report this week that Al-Qaeda basically has been supporting Israel, and Al-Qaeda called on Hamas to free all of the captives of war and give them back to Israel. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS just conveniently always happen to be on the side of the U.S. and Israel. What a coincidence. And then they always happen, and the U.S. and Israel always coincidentally kill the major enemies of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. What a coincidence. But anyway, getting back to this point. So after Trump assassinated this top Iraqi military commander on Iraqi soil, an act of war against Iraq, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel the U.S. troops occupying the country. Trump refused to. He threatened sanctions on Iraq. Biden came in. He claimed, I'm going to reverse Trump's policies. Of course, he didn't. He continued those policies, which are bipartisan. And the U.S. has continued militarily occupying Iraq, which explains why there have been constant attacks, not just in the past year, but going back years. Every few weeks or a month or so, there's another attack on the U.S. troops in Syria and the U.S. troops in Iraq. And then the U.S. uses this as an excuse to constantly launch airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. And these are not just Israeli attacks. If you look, in the past year, the Biden administration has bombed Iraq. They say that they're no longer at war with Iraq. Why are they still bombing Iraq? They say we have to defend their soldiers. Well, why are your soldiers there? They're occupying the country because you're at war with Iraq, and you're at war with Syria, and you're at war with Iran, and you're at war with Yemen. I mean, the U.S. and Israel are at war with so many countries in the region. Now imagine if they escalate to a whole new level and it's a full-on war with Iran. That means that these forces in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, they're not going to hold anything back. They have been very measured, very tempered in the attacks that they've carried out against the U.S. military occupiers and against Israel. But if Israel escalates into a full-on war with Iran, there are no more limits. Everything, they're going full out. And then Hezbollah is going to launch massive missile strikes against Tel Aviv. Because Hezbollah has also been holding back, only responding not even proportionately, less than proportionately. If you look at a chart, this has been reported in mainstream media, look at a chart of the cross-border attacks between Lebanon and Israel. Israel has no real borders, but it has never defined its borders. But the so-called borders of Israel, if you look at the cross-border attacks between Lebanon and Israel in the past year, Israel has carried out about 8 times more attacks on Lebanon than Lebanon has carried out against Israel. But if they escalate into a full-on war, every force in the region is going to go all out. They're going to use all the missiles they have, all the drones they have. And Israel would be devastated. So I think they've gotten the message here. And again, I need to stress this point. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but Israel is so used to bombing women and children trapped in the Gaza concentration camp, bulldozing homes in the West Bank, imprisoning children who are throwing stones. These are soldiers who do not have morale. They're not committed. They complain about minor little inconveniences. They are not willing to sacrifice their lives to fight against hardened, trained foes who are defending their countries. The Lebanese are defending their countries. The Yemenis are defending their country. The Iranians would be defending their country if there were this war. We've already seen in Israel this massive exodus of these people just fleeing because a lot of them have dual passports. They're going to the US, Canada, Europe, Australia. And if there's an actual war, we're going to see many more leave. Yeah, because, it's not just Israel constantly says we have the best technology. The US says we're always going to give Israel the qualitative military edge. That's their favorite phrase, qualitative military edge. But what we found out is that just because you have the most advanced technology, just because you get tens of billions of dollars of military assistance from the US, you can't make up for the differences in size, the differences in morale, the differences in training level. We see this in Ukraine. The US thinks that they can just pump Ukraine full of advanced technology and they'll win the war. And we see that it's been a complete disaster for Ukraine. And Israel also, it's so arrogant. It thinks we can kill everyone because it has advanced technology. It can take out leadership. But taking out leadership, as we've seen, is not defeating Hezbollah, because this is an organization like Hamas, like other resistance groups in the region. They know that Israel is going to try to kill their leaders. So for every single leader, they have assistants and they have multiple backups who can take their place to continue fighting. And that's why Israel cannot win. The only solution is genocide and ethnic cleansing, or surrender, or finally allowing the people of the region to have sovereignty and equal rights, giving Palestinians sovereignty. Because as we see in Gaza, they're trying to ethnically cleanse the northern part of Gaza and push out all of the Palestinians. That's their only solution. But that's not a solution in the medium to the long term, of course, because that resistance will still continue unless they eliminate everyone, which, of course, some of them want to do. Some Israeli officials have said we should just starve all 2 million Gazans. But unfortunately, they say the international community won't let us carry out this mass genocide against everyone in Gaza.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, Ben, there are reports now in the Jerusalem Post. This is very interesting, given that Iran is reporting that these strikes that we're talking about have indeed been limited and have been thwarted in many respects, if not all respects. And here we have Israel. I think you will. We should be very angry, of course, that Israel is just absolutely disgusting behavior. It's war criminality. It's genocidal campaign. But this, Ben, this Jerusalem Post reports Israel strikes Iran. Is deterrence the key to prevent an all-out war? The ball is back in Tehran's court. If Iran is not deterred, further escalation may be necessary. This is literally an admission, Ben, that these strikes have now happened. Whatever. I mean, I'm still confused about what exactly they were, but now they're saying, now this is coming from Israeli media, which, to be frank, Jerusalem Post is a mouthpiece of official Israel. And they're saying now that this was all about deterrence toward Iran, and that now Iran has to, has to be the one to either respond or not. And the ball is in their court. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, but I think this demonstrates many things that we've been talking about. Ben, final comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's so funny seeing the Jerusalem Post, this Israeli propaganda outlet, saying that the ball is in Iran's court to see if Israel has established deterrence, when in fact I think it's Iran that has established deterrence, right? Israel would love to continue escalating, but the fact that Iran has established deterrence and shown that, unlike women and children in Gaza who can't defend themselves, Iran can defend itself very capably. The other point to respond to briefly is that you mentioned the Jerusalem Post being a mouthpiece for Israel. We should always keep in mind, this is almost never mentioned in the Western media. The Israeli media is completely controlled by the government. And there's this idea, Israel says we're the only democracy in the Middle East, which is absurd. It's not a democracy. And there are other countries in the region that are quite democratic, including Lebanon, which they're attacking right now. Despite all of the problems Lebanon has, it's much more democratic than the Israeli regime. Iran is much more democratic than the Israeli regime. Iran just elected a new president who was from the reformist movement, which the West loves to claim that the Iranian regime doesn't allow people to have a voice. Well, they just elected a new president from this reformist movement. Anyway, the point is that part of this narrative that Israel is supposedly the only democracy in the Middle East is the West says, look, Israel has a free press. It's not a free press at all. Of course, the U.S. doesn't have a free press either, as we see. It's controlled by the Pentagon and CIA, and they use it to spread disinformation and justify wars of aggression. But the point is that Israel has a very aggressive military censor that controls all information that can be published about the war that it's carrying out in Gaza, on Lebanon, on Yemen, on Syria, on Iraq, on Iran. So we're likely to only know a small percentage of what's actually happening, and in these reports, like in the Jerusalem Post, and what they're really, that report you cited, that's the voice of the Israeli military, right? That's the narrative that they're trying to get out. So it seems like from that report that Israel is kind of saying that they can't say it publicly because then it would, Iran said it publicly when they did this retaliatory attack in self-defense. Iran said, we don't want to escalate. We're done. Our attack was proportional according to international law. Israel can't say that publicly because they're run by these far-right maniacs who are just, they want everyone in the region to fear them, to see them as, these unstoppable fascist juggernauts who can kill anyone in their path, and these bloodthirsty maniacs who are willing to kill anyone in their path. And that's who they are, right? Like, right. They are those things, but they need to maintain that bravado. They can't admit that they don't want to escalate because they're afraid of the repercussions. So I think a report like this is an indirect way of them saying, now the ball's in Iran's court, which is actually what Iran had previously said. And so I don't expect Iran to retaliate further, which would actually be a retaliatory attack, right? Because this is how these things work. This is how time works. It goes in a line. Israel attacked, Iran responded. Israel attacked, Iran responded. Here we are again. Israel has attacked, but Iran has showed a lot of strategic patience. We talked about that in previous streams. And I think that at this point, they're probably going to allow the Lebanese resistance and the Palestinian resistance to defend themselves, and the Yemenis. But of course, Iran is not going to just sit on its hands. Iran is still always providing military support and intelligence support to these resistance forces in the region.
Oh, yes, indeed. And there were reports before these strikes that Iran was preparing for what Israel had in store for it. And it seems like Iran has demonstrated. Why would it need to so-called retaliate? Why would it need to retaliate at all? Why would it need to respond if it was successful in thwarting any kind of significant impact from this attack? So that's exactly it seems to be exactly right, Ben, your analysis. And, I wanted to get back, now that we have talked about this strike, to the overall picture, to kind of close on the Middle East here, or on West Asia, because there are reports that Israel's ground operation in Lebanon, and we have to preface everything about what we hear from Israeli media, or even just overall breaking reports from this region. They tend to come from Israeli media, actually, and they tend to be rife with what's popularly known as Hasbara, just absolute lies. So we don't know if this is the case or not, but according to Israeli media, there are reports of the ground operation in Lebanon in its final stages. Some are saying 1 to 2 weeks. Who knows? But I think the point is that there is an appetite for this to come to an end. Of course, as you said, Ben, and as you've made a great point about, Israel keeps this bravado going. They don't report anything, even with the Iran strikes. They're not reporting where they struck, even though it already happened. So it's not like it has to be a secret anymore, but they're not reporting on that. They never do. They never take credit for anything. So I wanted to ask you, Ben, there's this overall picture. You have this ground operation coming to a close. They're saying it's because they've been winning, but I've been seeing reports about Hezbollah taking out 38 Israeli tanks in just a matter of a month, less than a month since this operation started. And many, many Israeli soldiers killed and wounded. Israeli IDF, IOF morale is at a very big low. And you also have Israel once again attacking Jabalia refugee camp, committing horrific massacres, but still fighting Palestinian resistance. It's not gone. I think we haven't spoken since Yahya Sinwar was killed. That whole debacle, which was a huge PR blow in many ways to the IDF. And then, of course, you have the rest of the resistance still fighting. Israel has been trying to also attack resistance in Syria, resistance in Iraq, trying to isolate these forces. Yemen, the U.S. and Israel have been bombing Yemen. So we have all of these fronts. Israel is saying it's being attacked. But this overall situation, as you said, it doesn't look good because Israel is no longer safe. It reminds me of Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, when all the Portuguese colonialists, they had to run because not only was the anti-colonial struggle happening, but they were embroiled. There was a whole other war going on that they could not sustain, but it wasn't safe anymore. It wasn't safe because there was not only a lot of pressure externally, but huge pressure internally to get out. And that seems to be what's happening to Israel. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's the same thing that happened to the Pieds Noirs, the French settlers in Algeria, right? When the colonized people rise up and defend their sovereignty, the settlers often end up voluntarily leaving. I mean, they are being pushed out, but in many cases they decide to leave, right? It's not like they're necessarily being pushed out of the barrel of a gun because they no longer feel safe in this country that they have been terrorizing for decades and colonizing. And when the majority of the indigenous people rise up, they decide, I'm going to go back to the colonial metropole. So this happened so many times in history. Now, on the point of the Israeli soldiers who have been killed in Lebanon, of course, I mentioned that Israel has a very strict censor in the media. So we don't know how many soldiers have been killed, but it seems like a lot of Israeli soldiers have been killed because even despite the military censor restricting information, we've seen many reports of Israeli soldiers being killed. And what's fascinating about this attempted Israeli invasion of Lebanon is how it's been a complete failure thus far. Israel has barely been able to go a few kilometers into Lebanon, whereas previously, for instance, in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, because Israel has constantly invaded Lebanon multiple times over decades, Israel was able to go to Beirut, right up to the capital. Now it can barely even enter the south. I mean, this shows how much the situation has changed and how Hezbollah is not in any way defeated. Yes, their leadership was killed by Israel, but Hezbollah is a decentralized organization, especially the fighting units like Hamas. These are decentralized fighting units. In many cases, they have these cells of fighters who don't even know who is in the other cells, right? And they have this kind of operational security that makes sure that it's decentralized in a way that prevents decapitation. Israel says, we decapitated Hezbollah leadership. Well, okay, but the organization was designed in a way so it cannot be decapitated. So we've also seen these incredible reports of how Israeli soldiers were crossing over and Hezbollah had all of these cameras hidden in these rocks in different areas and were able to ambush the Israeli soldiers. I mean, it's going very badly for Israel, despite the fact that, again, they boast of all the technology they have. And yeah, they can constantly bomb the hell out of Beirut and the suburbs of Beirut in the south and bomb densely populated civilian areas. They're very good at that. They're very good at displacing 1 million Lebanese, pushing them out of their homes, especially the Shia population, which, they're portraying their war as a kind of religious sectarian war. And Israel is also trying to start a sectarian conflict and a civil war inside Lebanon, as they did previously, always with the backing of the US. But the reality is that the resistance in Lebanon is much, much stronger than it has been in the past. Even in 2006, when Hezbollah was able to successfully defeat Israel, it was still not as strong, nearly as strong then as it is today. So for people who don't know, briefly, so 1982, actually 1978, Israel invaded Lebanon, but it had a full-scale invasion in 1982, and then it occupied southern Lebanon officially from 1985 until 2000. And Hezbollah was only created in response to the Israeli invasion and occupation of South Lebanon. Hezbollah was formed as a national liberation organization fighting to expel the Israeli military occupiers, and they successfully did so in 2000, fighting a guerrilla war. And then in 2006, Israel launched another war on Lebanon, bombing the hell out of Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. And when they were leaving, they dropped thousands of cluster bombs, little cluster munitions that have continued to kill and wound children in the years since, because there are so many cluster bombs lying around, right? But the point is that in 2006, Israel was defeated. Israel says, oh, well, we accomplished our goals and we withdrew. But if you're fighting, if you're a large conventional military and you're fighting a guerrilla force and you withdraw, that's a loss. That's like saying the U.S. says, "Oh, we didn't lose in Vietnam." You lost. Israel lost to Hezbollah, and in the past decade, Hezbollah has become stronger. It has much better technology, including drones, and its fighters have been battle hardened in the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria and on the border of Lebanon with Syria. So, I mean, we don't know if these reports are correct, and maybe they are. I mean, so some of these reports are citing the Israeli radio broadcaster that said that supposedly in the next 2 weeks, so we're talking now on the October 26th, so supposedly in the next 2 weeks, they will be withdrawing from Lebanon. I'm very skeptical. This could be, you know, what they call like gray propaganda, where it's like, it's part of this disinformation strategy where Israel puts out this message to try to get people to think that they're going to withdraw, maybe because of the election, maybe to try to wage psychological warfare. But the reality is that Israel has barely moved into Lebanon anyway, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they should withdraw because every inch they try to take of Lebanon is an illegal war of invasion, a colonial war. But the fact that they've barely even been able to enter Lebanon is I think a testament to just how different this conflict is compared to past invasions and just how much stronger the resistance is now.
Yeah, Ben, and what have you made of this? Because right now, what it seems like is Israel's public relations strategy when it comes to all of these fronts, whether it's the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, Palestine proper, because West Bank is also under siege, or whether it's Hezbollah, even Iran, there is this emphasis on decapitation, on assassination, on taking out the head of these organizations and continuing to boast and emphasize that, oh, well, if you take out this Hezbollah leader, Nasrallah, or there's been many since then, well, that equals victory. But at the same time, they will never show what's happening on the ground. As you said, they don't show videos. Hezbollah will show many videos of them targeting Merkava tanks and targeting invading Israeli soldiers, but you'll never see that from Israel itself, ever. We'll never see it. Actually, what we do see only are the images coming out of both Lebanon and Gaza of the horrific massacres that these troops are committing. That's all you will get. But Israel itself will never show what it's doing on the ground. I mean, what do you make of this strategy? It seems like the way that Israel wants to portray itself as powerful is completely dependent upon getting maybe it's world public opinion, or maybe it's Israeli public opinion, maybe it's both, to believe that, well, if you're taking out the top dog of any resistance organization, then you are in fact winning. But it seems like now even Israelis, I don't know if you saw, Ben, but Benjamin Netanyahu's apartment was targeted by Hezbollah, and many are saying that it's probably because someone on the inside of of Israel is providing information, because there might be some appetite to well, not only get rid of Netanyahu, but perhaps stop this, as you said. Might not be for the reasons that we want to stop the invasion of Lebanon, the genocide of Gaza, but it's there are reasons nonetheless for this to stop, because it obviously doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, well, this gets back to a famous quote, and I've seen it attributed to different Israeli officials, Moshe Alon, Golda Meir. I don't know what the original source is, but it's been widely quoted in different media outlets, which is that Israel says the biggest danger is when they no longer fear us. That's what it's afraid of. When the Palestinians and other people in the region, when they no longer fear us. This is one of the biggest weapons that Israel has, is this fear, is being able to threaten women and children trapped in the Gaza concentration camp, threaten Palestinian children. If they throw a rock, they're going to face the rest of their life in prison, or they'll just be killed if they throw a rock, right? So you have to maintain this fear. It's this kind of Machiavellian strategy. But what we've seen is that the resistance forces have lost that fear. They're not afraid of Israel. This is why the US constantly says Israel must maintain a qualitative military edge. That's the phrase. What does that mean? It means that Israel must massively outarm all of the other militaries and armed forces in the region. It must have a technological superiority. If not, they're outnumbered. I mean, again, this gets back to the French settlers in Algeria, the British settlers in Kenya, the Dutch Afrikaners in South Africa. When the indigenous people rise up against the Western settlers, Israel is a big European colonial outpost that after the decline of the British Empire, which helped to create Israel, the US empire became its new protector, right? When the indigenous people no longer are afraid of the well-armed settlers, which are always a small minority compared to the majority of the indigenous, then the system collapses very quickly. And I think we're in the stages of that. Now, I don't think Israel is going to collapse tomorrow or next year or in even 2 or 3 years, but we're seeing a severe structural crisis where for decades, Israel has been able to just terrorize everyone around it, not just the Palestinians, but all of their neighbors, devastate the neighboring militaries. So, for instance, the famous 1967 war in which Israel occupied the West Bank, it occupied the Syrian Golan Heights, it even occupied the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt, and then eventually was forced to withdraw. The point is that Israel is used to, in these wars, launching these surprise attacks, destroying the Egyptian military in this surprise attack, right? So Israel is so used to having this much greater technology. So even though it's a small little colony, it can prevent the other larger countries in the region from liberating Palestine. But we've gotten to the point where that first of all, that qualitative military edge is not as significant, especially what we've now seen with a country like Yemen. The resistance forces in Yemen have shown that you can use these very cheap drones that Iran helps to manufacture, and you can use them to destroy missiles and other military technology that costs millions and millions of dollars. So there's also the difference not only in the technology, but the difference in the costs. So you can bleed the Israeli military and the US. I mean, if the US is now spending $1.5 trillion a year on the military, the official military budget's a joke. It's not the real military budget. If you factor in all the other military expenses, like nuclear weapons, which are not considered part of the not considered part of the defense budget, which is hilarious. Like, how are nuclear weapons not part of the military budget? But anyway, the U.S. spends $1.5 trillion a year on its military, and then is sending, tens of billions of dollars of weapons to Israel. Yeah, it's a lot. We shouldn't underestimate that. However, if the Yemeni resistance can use a cheap drone to destroy a multi-million-dollar U.S. missile, I mean, who really has the technological superiority there? I mean, on paper, yeah, the U.S. and Israel do, but this gets to the whole point of like the discussion of U.S. GDP, which is grossly inflated because, about 20% of it consists of finance, insurance, and real estate. Right. Nearly 20% of it is bloated, expensive healthcare, right? So, yeah, the U.S. can spend all of this money and flush it down the drain, and big corporations can spend over 90% of their revenue buying back their own stocks to inflate their stock value or paying dividends. But that doesn't mean that the economy is becoming more productive. So on paper, yeah, the economy is so big, it's so powerful, but in reality, it's a paper tiger. And Israel is increasingly being shown that it's also a paper tiger. Yeah, it can terrorize women and children trapped in Gaza, but it cannot even defeat Hamas. It cannot defeat Hamas. It can assassinate their leaders, and then it can say with the propaganda, it has power. It is powerful media projection through propaganda, and you can say Yahya Sinwar was dressed as a woman with a hijab, and he was hiding in the tunnels, and he had millions of dollars, and his wife had a fancy, luxurious bag. I mean, all of this fake news, disinformation, right? When in reality, we now know that Sinwar was on the front lines fighting bravely to defend his people.
Incredible stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that itself, think about how powerful that image is that video that Israel itself leaked. I mean, this is the arrogance.
They brought a drone into where they had just essentially massacred him. They were essentially torturing him, and then they sent a drone in there to videotape his last moments. And then go on, Ben, about what happened.
Yeah, and then Israel says, "Look how pitiful this guy is. He tries to throw a stick at the drone." It's like, yeah, you cut off his right arm. What is he supposed to do? You can see in the video his arm is cut off, and he was right-handed, so he's trying to throw a stick with his left hand. I mean, the point is that, I mean, that itself is the perfect symbol. It doesn't matter that Israel has all this advanced technology and these drones, because at the end of the day, it's outnumbered. It's a bunch of Western settlers trying to colonize this land. They failed in Algeria. The French failed in Algeria. The British failed in Kenya. The Dutch failed in South Africa. They failed. The British failed in Rhodesia. And the Zionist colonial project is failing in Palestine. So, I mean, what we're seeing is, again, I don't want to be one of these hyperbolic people who says that Israel is going to collapse tomorrow. I think it's going to be part of a longer process. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be a bloody process. It's going to be a protracted process, but it's very clear that Israel is in severe decline. It might take several more decades, who knows? But this is not a settler colonial country that is at the peak of its power. It's certainly not. It's in the decadent phase, and we can very clearly see that. And they still think they're as powerful as they were in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but they're not.
Yeah, no, and it almost feels like similar to the Ukraine proxy war really accelerated so many processes in the decline of US NATO overall power and hegemony over the globe. It feels like definitely this October 7, 2023, what happened thereafter, it feels like Israel, while it looked like Israel was wielding all of its heaviest might by committing a genocide on the Palestinian people, and then, of course, extending it outward as far as it can go now, as we're talking about Iran and Hezbollah and Yemen, it does feel like that was actually a huge miscalculation, because there's so many reports about Israel being caught in a long war, Israeli military, which, as we said, is full of reservists who just want to go back to work and get back to the real benefits of colonization. Real benefits of colonization are enjoying the fruits of colonization, making money, attaining property, living in social peace relatively, being protected by that. If Iron Dome is a metaphor, being protected by the Iron Dome, those walls, those fences, all of that, and of course being protected by the guns and the weapons that are surrounding you. That is supposed to be what they really want to do, but now they can't do it anymore because the Hezbollah, Yemen, Iran is a state, so Iran is going to behave a little differently, but Hezbollah, Yemen, these forces, Palestinian resistance, they can't stop, first of all, because the war has come right to them. And, now it seems like also Israel has gone out of control with not just Hezbollah and now Lebanon, which U.S. media has admitted is a regime change operation in part because they want Hezbollah out of the government. They don't want Hezbollah. I believe that they want to try to eliminate Hezbollah's leadership in part because they believe if they do that, then Hezbollah won't be able to operate as a political force. I think it's kind of ridiculous. I don't know. I don't know what it could be going through the minds as that being accurate intelligence or whatever, but that seems to be what even Western media reports. So Ben, final comment on this. Yes, Israel seems to be in decline. It is a slow rolling collapse, but it's this moment also feels like at any point, these kind of huge crossings of, if we want to call them red lines, just crossing of lines that lead into a spiraling of conflict can accelerate this process tenfold. And we can't necessarily predict it, but Israel seems to want to tiptoe on that. And the US, of course, fully supports this, which is incredible given that they claim they're constantly trying to talk Israel down.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, look at the economy. I mean, this is the most important sign. We don't know the exact estimate, again, because of the military censor, but some people said that in the past year, Israel's GDP has shrunk 10%, and in the last quarter, 20%. I mean, we're talking about Great Depression style economic crisis going on in Israel. And a lot of this is because of this mass exodus. Again, this huge brain drain where any Israeli with a dual passport, engineers, doctors, venture capitalists, they're leaving the country, right? And they're going to the US, they're going to Australia, Europe. So you're having this massive loss of advanced technology, massive loss of trained workers, medical experts, and the economy is really suffering. There's also this issue of regime change and how in the past it was quite easy for the U.S. and Israel to just replace leaders in the region. But we saw that one of the turning points was the war in Syria. The U.S. failed. The U.S., with the support of Israel, was trying to overthrow the Syrian government. We now know, of course, that the CIA was spending $1 billion per year in the largest ever covert operation done by the CIA since the famous Operation Cyclone in the 1980s, in which the CIA armed and trained the Mujahideen, extremists in Afghanistan that gave birth to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Well, the U.S. did a similar operation in Syria starting in 2011, trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and they failed. Despite the fact that they devastated Syria as a country, they devastated the Syrian people. Hundreds of thousands of people died in this horrific U.S.-led dirty war that Israel also later admitted to play a part in. The Israeli military chief admitted that Israel was giving weapons and support to the so-called moderate rebels in Syria that were allied with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, and that the Israeli military was also, this was reported by the Jerusalem Post, Israel was treating Al-Qaeda fascists in Syria in Israeli hospitals and then sending them back to Syria to go fight against the Syrian government. They failed. And now we've seen that the U.S. has been trying to regime change Yemen, the Ansar Allah led government in Yemen. They've completely failed. Now they're trying to do the same thing in Lebanon. I mean, this has been a process going back a few years. The Trump administration put very aggressive sanctions on Lebanon that were partially aimed at collapsing the Lebanese economy, and they were devastating. Lebanon went through a hyperinflation crisis. Part of this was because of the neoliberal economists who were running the Lebanese central bank, who had this scheme where they had a fixed exchange rate, and then their banks were offering these really high interest rates on deposits that they could not pay off. It was an unsustainable Ponzi scheme. And then eventually they ran out of foreign exchange reserves, especially because of the U.S. sanctions, which kind of popped this bubble. And then the economy went into crisis. There was hyperinflation. And the U.S. government said very clearly, I remember Mike Pompeo, the CIA director turned Secretary of State under Trump, he said, we want to remove Hezbollah from government. He basically was saying, we are suffocating the Lebanese economy until there's a new government, until Hezbollah, which is a registered political party with democratically elected members of parliament, until they leave government. And they failed to do that, despite the horrific suffering that they caused to the Lebanese people. And then now we see that once again, the U.S. is publicly saying we want to change the Lebanese government. They want to install this Lebanese military officer, Aoun, who's a Western puppet. But what's incredible about this is that there was a report that the U.S. is pressuring Lebanon to hold new elections, which is their way of regime change, right? The U.S. always says this. In the past, they used to be a little more blatant and say, yeah, we just want to install Pinochet in Chile, right? Or Videla in Argentina, these fascist military dictators. Now they're a little more sophisticated. They say, okay, we want early elections. And then, of course, they rig the elections. The U.S. funds all of the opposition candidates. They use media outlets to spread propaganda. So they put their puppets in power, right? Through the early elections. It's a new, more sophisticated form of regime change. But in the case of Lebanon, a U.S. official was asked, okay, fine. If you want Lebanon to hold new elections, then the Lebanese parliament has to meet. But can you promise that Israel won't bomb the Lebanese parliament? Because Hezbollah has a dozen members of parliament, democratically elected representatives from the Hezbollah political party. They're not affiliated with the armed wing of Hezbollah. But what was the U.S. response? We cannot guarantee that Israel will not bomb Lebanon's parliament and kill parliamentarians, which obviously, how can you have an election if they can't even hold a meeting of parliament? So, I mean, this is the incredible situation we're in, where we see who's really in charge of Lebanon. You know, our friend Rania Khalek, a great Lebanese American journalist, she constantly points this out, that all of these Western-funded fake intellectuals in Lebanon, all the fake so-called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which are actually funded by the U.S. government. So they're not NGOs. They're semi-governmental organizations funded by the U.S. All these fake, you know, pro-Western fake intellectuals in Lebanon, they say Lebanon is controlled by Iran. Iran controls Lebanon through its so-called proxy Hezbollah, which is not a Lebanese, which is not an Iranian proxy. Hezbollah is an indigenous Lebanese resistance organization with its origins in the fight to defend Lebanese sovereignty against Israeli colonialism. But the point is that Iran absolutely does not control Lebanon. We see who really controls Lebanon. It's the United States. It's the U.S. who says we're going to try to put in a new government. It's the U.S. who says we're going to try to collapse the old government and suffocate the economy. It's the U.S. that funds the media outlets in the country. And it's the U.S. that allows its Israeli attack dog to invade Lebanon, giving them a green light, saying that, yeah, we support this so-called limited operation to invade Lebanon. The U.S. said that very clearly. The State Department did not hide it. They say, we support this invasion. And of course, Israel is using U.S. bombs, U.S. military equipment. So this narrative that Iran supposedly controls Lebanon is psychological projection for what the U.S. has been doing to the region.
Yeah, all very good points, Ben. And I think it's now appropriate to get to what has now been, given that just days after its end, or not even a day, barely a day after it ended, you have now all of these reports about Iran, about Lebanon coming out. But we do need to talk about the BRICS Summit in Kazan, Russia. And I wanted to begin, Ben, because many people, when we talk about BRICS, want to hear about de-dollarization and the economic alternative being built. But first, I'd like to begin with the BRICS Summit on the political and geopolitical significance, in particular with regard to just immediately as the summit started, Ben, there were numerous reports about how the West and the US, NATO's, all of their campaigns to isolate Vladimir Putin had dramatically failed, given that we had over 30 plus leaders attend the BRICS Summit events. They were all of them, pretty very strategically important countries. Of course, all of them in the global south. NATO member Turkey expressing a lot of enthusiasm about eventually joining. There was an expansion of partner countries, 13 now, partner countries, along with the, I know you've talked about this, the disputed number of BRICS plus countries. Currently, I think it's 8. Am I right? But I wanted to ask you first about this isolation, this seemingly crumbling campaign to isolate Russia, on the heels of also one of the biggest and most significant developments also too was the Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi bilateral meeting that happened at BRICS, which many believe finalized the border deal, the disputes that are increasingly now being settled, not fully settled, but on the direction, on that path between China and India. Huge. First in 5+ years, that meeting seems to have set the stage for a lot more of this crumbling, of this attempt by the United States to isolate both Russia and China. So what did you make of the BRICS Summit in this regard to begin?
Yeah, this is a very historic summit, and it was very successful. Now, to clarify to people, so BRICS officially now has 9 members. So the original 5, right? Well, there was originally 4, right? So BRICS was formed in 2009, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. In 2010, South Africa was added, becoming BRICS. And then in 2023, at the meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, BRICS for the first time expanded, and it invited 6 new countries to join, which were Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Argentina. 4 of those countries have officially joined. They were invited in 2023, and they officially joined on the 1st of January of 2024. So those 4 new official members are Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. And this summit in Kazan, Russia, was the first summit featuring the expanded BRICS members. There are now 9. So what happened to the other 2? Saudi Arabia has not officially confirmed that it's a member. It is neither confirmed nor denied. So maybe they will, but clearly Saudi Arabia is trying to balance its relationship with the West and BRICS. Of course, Saudi Arabia historically has been a very close U.S. ally. It's playing this kind of non-aligned role. Now, Argentina withdrew from the offer. So what happened is that at the BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2023, at that time, the Argentine government was center-left. It was led by the president, Alberto Fernandez, and vice president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. And they agreed, they were very pro-BRICS, and they agreed to join. However, the far-right leader, Javier Milei, who is extremely pro-US, he came to power in December, 1 month before Argentina would officially have joined, and he withdrew from the offer. So I think the reason that at this summit in Kazan, Russia in 2024, I think the reason that they decided instead to have a new process for joining, which they call partner countries, is because they don't want to repeat that disaster, the PR disaster of Argentina, right? Of having a country that says it's going to join, and then it has a change of government, and then it withdraws. Obviously, that looks bad. So I think their strategy instead is they're going to have a process that's not dissimilar to the process of joining the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has partner countries that eventually become full members. So Iran recently became a full member of the SCO, and now other countries, Belarus and others are trying to become part of the SCO as well. The SCO, for people who don't know, it overlaps a lot with BRICS, although the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is more of a security-oriented organization. It was originally created by China and Russia and some Central Asian countries to deal with the problem of extremism and these violent extremist groups in the region. And then it expanded further, and now it includes China, Russia, India, and Pakistan, and Iran, and numerous Central Asian countries. So BRICS overlaps a little bit. BRICS, they do talk about security issues. BRICS is very broad. However, I think the biggest real focus of BRICS, the main focus is the economy, the global financial system, right? And trying to create alternatives. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But before that, the issue of this partner country expansion is, I think, very significant. So at the Kazan Summit, 13 countries were invited to be partner countries. They did not officially release a list. And again, I think that's because they're afraid of this Argentina situation happening again. They don't want a country to be invited and then have a change of government and then withdraw. However, at first we saw this list going around. I wasn't sure if it was correct because there weren't good sources. However, there are now a few different sources. So Indian journalists quoting Indian diplomats published a list. Brazilian journalists quoting Brazilian diplomats at the meeting also published a list. It's the same list. And that has been further reported on by some South Asian diplomats. And so this is the list of the 13 new partner countries: Algeria, Belarus, Cuba, Bolivia, Malaysia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Thailand, Vietnam, Nigeria, Uganda, Indonesia, and Turkey, which is very significant, of course, because Turkey is a member of NATO. So we see that it's, playing this kind of non-aligned role of balancing the West and the East. Now, a few takeaways from this that's very important. First of all, it's good to see more representation of Latin America. This has been something that has been advocated by a lot of countries in the region. Nicaragua was also present at the BRICS Summit. The foreign minister was there, and Nicaragua has applied to join. And Venezuela. Now, we can talk about this. Unfortunately, it seems that Brazil vetoed Venezuela's membership because of this political conflict, which is very unfortunate, and I think a major betrayal by the Lula government. But it is good to see that Bolivia and Cuba have been accepted as partner states. And they're very likely they're not going to have a change of government like in Cuba and Bolivia that goes to the right. That's just not going to happen. So they're very likely going to join. It's also very noteworthy that Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, are interested in joining BRICS. So Indonesia is one of the most populous countries on earth, a very fast-growing economy, a lot of natural resources, a growing industrial sector. China has been helping to industrialize, building battery plants and car factories. So Indonesia has a lot of potential. Also Malaysia, which is also part of ASEAN, also very interesting. Thailand, another country that's kind of playing both sides. And very importantly, Vietnam. Of course, another country like China that is governed by a communist party with a socialist system. Vietnam also has a very fast-growing economy. In fact, if you take out China, Vietnam has had probably the most explosive economic growth in the past 2 decades. And Vietnam has been industrializing very quickly, developing a lot of advanced technologies. So it's interesting to see that Southeast Asia is very highly represented. I think this is a sign of how ASEAN is also being very activist in this kind of role and helping to build a multipolar world. ASEAN also had a historic summit in 2023 in which they called for de-dollarizing their bilateral trade using local currencies. What's also interesting is we see representation from Central Asia, Kazakhstan, a very big country with a lot of resources, of course, between China and Russia. So Kazakhstan and also Uzbekistan, both are partner states. And then, of course, more representation from Africa is very important. So Uganda, which recently held this year, it's the president of the non-aligned movement, and Uganda recently held the conference, the summit of the non-aligned movement, showing how it's trying to play more of a role in the global south. And also Algeria. Of course, Algeria had a revolution against French colonialism. It has had a kind of, nationalist, anti-colonial government. So I think this is very important, seeing these countries that are now becoming part of BRICS. And then we can talk about some of the other things discussed at BRICS, especially the plans for trying to create an alternative to the US-dominated global financial system. But before we talk about that, one other point that you mentioned is really important, which is that one of the most significant developments that happened at BRICS actually happened before the conference even started, which is this really historic agreement signed between China and India. This is really, I'm really happy about this, because I was really concerned that India was leaning really too much into the pro-Western camp. And now we see that India is trying to rebalance its relations a little bit. Of course, India is still part of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is a de facto US-led security group, which consists of the US, Japan, India, and Australia. And although they say that they're not an anti-China group, we all know that they're an anti-China group. So the fact that India is part of that is quite concerning. However, in the past few years, India has had some diplomatic tensions with the West, especially with Canada and the US, over these allegations that Indian intelligence operatives carried out an assassination of Indian dissidents living in North America. So this has led to a slight cooling of relations. And I think India is trying to rebalance its relations. So I'm not expecting India to be great friends with China, but the fact that they signed this historic agreement that will resolve the border dispute is very important. China has put a lot of emphasis on this. And, talking to Chinese academics who study this kind of thing, they said that this has been a real issue. And it actually meant that China didn't even have an ambassador in India for a few years. Earlier in 2024, China did finally send its ambassador to India again. So that was a sign of tensions reducing and relations improving a little bit. And then finally, this first meeting in years that was held between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi is very significant. So I think that's a very important step forward. And I should mention that Russia bears responsibility. It should get credit for this, because Moscow has really been trying to encourage better relations between China and India. Russia, of course, has a very good diplomatic corps. Sergei Lavrov is a very skilled diplomat, probably one of the best diplomats on earth. And the Russian foreign ministry has been really, which has good relations with both India and with China separately, and has been really trying to encourage them to put aside their differences and work together. And they've been successful in that. And I should also add another element of this is the Indian capitalist class, the Indian bourgeoisie.
Yes.
They really want Chinese investment because China is at the cutting edge of so many technologies. Chinese wages have risen a lot. You wouldn't know this if you read a lot of the Western media, but the standard of living in China has risen by many times in recent decades, and wages are much higher than in other countries in the region. So what this means is that now some Chinese companies are thinking about moving operations to other countries, and India is a place where they could potentially move. So there are a lot of Indian capitalists who want that Chinese investment, and they were pressuring the Indian government to improve relations. So I think this is a very important step forward, and it shows that this attempt by the U.S. to try to put a wedge in BRICS, to try to break up the BRICS by increasing these tensions between China and India, that strategy for now is not succeeding, which is always a good sign.
Totally. And as you said, and this isn't Russian propaganda or Putin's message to us. This is just the truth. Russia was the president of BRICS this year. And at BRICS, all of these things that you talked about, which lead to not just BRICS expanding its base of and its network of countries working together to building up this mechanism. Russia was the president this year of BRICS and facilitated the basis, the platform from which all of this occurred, and it just absolutely caused mind melt for the Western media, which seemed to be shocked that all of the reasons why BRICS has accelerated is so much in the last 2 years has to do a lot of it has to do with one conflict, which is what happened in Ukraine. But there's so much more that comes out of the NATO and US proxy war in Ukraine that has created this huge impetus for this kind of unity. And Xi Jinping said in his speech, this is a platform for global South solidarity. This is what BRICS serves as the engine of. And we saw it. China set an example. Russia had the platform and, of course, provided a lot of legwork, as you said, to make that happen between China and India. And it seems to me that despite there were some hiccups, Saudi Arabia didn't come. And I think a lot of people were hoping Saudi Arabia would come to the
I'm
summit.
sorry to cut you off, Danny. To be fair, Saudi sent its foreign minister.
Yes,
Saudi
the
Crown
foreign
Prince
minister.
MBS did not.
Yes, right. Their top leader, yes, Mohammed bin Salman did not come. Yes, they had a foreign minister there, exactly. And of course, what you mentioned with Brazil, there's been a lot I've been seeing about how disappointing that was. But overall, it seems to be full steam ahead toward this mechanism, which I think is really interesting now, mimicking the SCO. It really does. I see reports Indonesia, right? I think that there is all these countries that are joining as partner countries. Most of them are going to want to join as full members. And now they're building out that apparatus, which is going to be so important for them to get things done. Because no way, I mean, we love consensus. We think it's great. It's an incredibly democratic model, but also things have to get done with BRICS. Decisions are going to have to be made. And it's going to be interesting to see how they rotate that structure too, to ensure that, even if not everything can be done by 100% consensus, that there will be involvement from all of these countries in building out these projects.
Yeah, it's so important. And what's fascinating is if you look at BRICS, even before expanding, it was already over 40% of the entire global population. Compare that to the G7. This is the group of 7 imperialist countries that colonized the world. So North America, Europe, and Japan. The G7 together has less than 10% of the world population. The original BRICS 5 together have over 40%, and now they keep growing. And they're adding very populous countries like Indonesia, one of the most populous on earth, and Nigeria, very populous country. So that's huge. Then there's the size of their economies. And earlier I was talking about how GDP can sometimes obfuscate more than it clarifies. Now, it's a useful measurement sometimes because you want to know how fast an economy is growing, the productive capacities of an economy. But the problem with GDP is that it includes all sectors of the economy together. And what you have to look at is what sectors of the economy are growing in proportion to the other sectors. So in the West, GDP is very heavily skewed toward the financial sector, toward the healthcare sector, and not toward manufacturing, not toward commodities. Whereas in the BRICS countries, which together they now represent, the original 5 members are over 1/3 of global GDP when you measure their GDP at purchasing power parity, which adjusts for the differences in exchange rates. But that actually underestimates their economic power when you look at things like commodities, right? So look at oil production. Even before adding Saudi Arabia, the BRICS countries expanded now, including the UAE and Iran, which are major oil producers, along with Russia, which is one of the top 3 oil producers on earth. Together, the BRICS 9 now produce over 30% of all oil in the world. If you add Saudi Arabia, that's over 40%. Now you're adding Nigeria, another oil producer, adding Algeria, another major oil producer, adding in some other countries like Indonesia, which has a lot of resources. Indonesia is the world's biggest producer of nickel. It also produces copper and bauxite. Bolivia has the world's largest lithium reserves. Kazakhstan has a lot of resources as well. I mean, we're talking about a commodities superpower. And, you know, we know OPEC, it has a lot of political influence. This is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they were formed in the 70s as a way of the Global South, essentially, to come together because they produced the majority of oil at the time, and they wanted to have influence over global oil prices to make sure that they're adequately compensated so they can develop economically. And OPEC has become a geopolitical powerhouse. Well, now BRICS increasingly looks like it's becoming a commodities powerhouse. And if these countries can come together and decide in how they can make sure they're getting better compensated for their commodities, because typically Global South countries export these primary commodities, these raw materials, to the advanced industrialized capitalist countries in the West, and then they use those resources to produce, you know, more advanced technologies. At least historically, that's what it was, although they've been offshoring a lot of that production in recent decades, right? The point is that now, what I was going to get at is that for decades, Global South countries have complained about the terms of trade. So this goes back to the dependency theorists, especially the Latin American economists in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Raúl Prebisch, these famous economists, Celso Furtado, who founded the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. One of their big complaints was that the terms of trade were in the favor of the Western industrialized countries against the raw materials exporting countries of the Global South. So over time, the countries of the Global South will get paid less and less for their commodities, especially in terms of the exchange rate of their currencies against the dominant currencies like the US dollar. So they were having all this value sucked out and siphoned toward the West, which would use those resources to create technology, right? Well, now what we're seeing is that the BRICS countries are going to have more influence over commodities markets, and they're also industrializing very quickly. China is the world's manufacturing superpower, right? So with Chinese manufacturing prowess and technology, through technology transfer, through the commodities that all of these countries have access to, I mean, we're talking about the economic engine of the entire world. So the US can have, you know, they can sell all this debt, and they have all these financial derivatives and investment banks and asset managers on Wall Street, and they have a big healthcare industry, and they have AI, whatever. But if you can't actually get all of the commodities you need to build those chips, which are not even being built in the US anyway, they're being built in Taiwan and mainland China, right? So the reality is that BRICS has so much economic potential, and now as it expands, I mean, we can talk about this plan as well to create to transform the global financial system. And one of the things that was discussed at this historic summit was the creation of a BRICS grain exchange, which is another, Putin emphasized that not only do they have all of these commodities, but that the BRICS countries are the world's leading producers also of many grains and oil, not just petroleum, but oil, food oil. And so Russia is going to oversee the creation of this BRICS grain exchange, which will be expanded to have exchanges for other commodities, including oil, natural gas, and gold, which could be used to settle trade imbalances. So, I really think that what's happening is absolutely historic, to a level that is maybe in some ways similar to the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 that established the global financial system based on the US dollar, with other currencies pegged to the US dollar, or set at a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar, and the dollar pegged to gold, and then created the IMF and the World Bank. Like that infrastructure that was created in the 40s with the US at the center, I think we're seeing a gradual move away from that. And these kinds of summits are very historic and will go down in the history textbooks.
Yes, yes, indeed. Ben, maybe on our final topic for today, you mentioned the financial architecture that the BRICS Summit in Kazan discussed. There was also a lot of symbolic gestures around currency. Vladimir Putin had given a gift of a piece of currency. It went viral all over Twitter. And
Yeah,
then,
actually, that was a photoshopped image.
oh my
I don't think
gosh.
that actually was. So there was a previous summit in which Russia created this like symbolic banknote that had the 5 BRICS countries. That wasn't this summit. That image where like Putin had that actually is not a real. So there are 2 images that went around. One of them is like Putin, he had his hand and supposedly he had the bill. That actually was photoshopped. So this is a historic summit, but I think some people sometimes they get a little carried away. Like we don't need to exaggerate.
Right. So there was, but there always is a lot of talk surrounding BRICS and when they meet over the last 2 years about de-dollarization and about creating a new financial architecture. Vladimir Putin talked about how the dollar has been used as a weapon, and that's why BRICS is such an important vehicle for potentially alleviating that kind of and creating an alternative to that kind of economic exploitation. So, Ben, what exactly at this BRICS summit, what occurred in terms of this financial architecture? You mentioned the grain exchange. What else, if anything, happened here that is leading toward this path, which is still very, as you were alluding to, still very embryonic in its phase?
Yeah, a lot of things did happen. Like I said, it was historic, and we should talk about the many important things that happened. Although I just wanted to say that on social media, sometimes people do exaggerate, right? So on the issue of the new mechanisms that were created, I mentioned the grain exchange, which will likely be expanded to include a gold exchange, oil, natural gas exchange, which is also a way of de-dollarizing, right? Because if countries have a big trade surplus, a country like China or Russia, they have current account surpluses. How will you settle those trade imbalances? Well, if Russia ends up with a lot of Indian rupees, there's not a lot that they can import from India. They already import certain commodities, right? But Russia is the world's largest producer of wheat. It's one of the largest producers of oil. It can import maybe a few other agricultural products from India, but if it has like a really big surplus, what does it do with all of that excess surplus? Well, with a BRICS grain exchange or oil exchange or gold exchange, it can transfer them for these commodities, for oil. It can stockpile oil. It can exchange them for gold, right? And gold is essentially becoming more and more important in the reserves held by central banks, because you can't really seize gold unless you have your gold physically in another country's central bank. Like the mistake that Venezuela made, it had its gold in the Bank of England, the British central bank, and they stole that gold, which is now worth over $2 billion from the Venezuelan central bank. So we saw that there was a massive watershed moment, which was in 2022. The Western powers stole $300 billion worth of dollar and euro denominated assets that were part of Russia's central bank reserves. This was a huge wake-up call. to countries around the world saying we have to de-dollarize our central bank reserves because we could be the next victims, including countries like Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, these countries that have been invited to join BRICS, right? So now, that's part of it. It's very historic. What was also discussed at the BRICS Summit and was announced in the Kazan Declaration that was published by all the members of BRICS is the creation of what they call a BRICS cross-border payment initiative. This is very important as well. So I mentioned the move toward de-dollarizing reserves because countries now see that it's no longer safe to hold dollar and euro denominated assets in their foreign exchange reserves. So they're buying a lot of gold, which is why gold prices have been skyrocketing, but they're also stockpiling other commodities. China has been importing a lot of metals. China has been importing a lot of oil for its strategic petroleum reserve. And then China has also been using its massive surplus and turning that into the Belt and Road Initiative investments, right, to build infrastructure, right? So that's de-dollarization of reserves, of savings. What about de-dollarization of cross-border payments, of trade, right? So when we're talking about de-dollarization, there are two sides of de-dollarization. De-dollarization of savings and investment on one side, and de-dollarization of trade. De-dollarization of trade has massively accelerated, and this was discussed in the BRICS Summit. So the BRICS cross-border payment initiative will help to connect many of the systems that already exist to facilitate cross-border payments among different BRICS members. So thus far, Russia and China have almost entirely de-dollarized their bilateral trade. 95% of the bilateral trade between China and Russia uses Chinese renminbi, also known as yuan, and Russian rubles. And Russia and India are doing bilateral trade in their currencies, the ruble and the rupee. Iran and Russia are doing trade in their currencies. And Brazil and China are doing trade in their currencies, the Brazilian real and the Chinese renminbi. In fact, what's funny is the original 5 BRICS members, all of their currencies begin with R. They're referred to as the 5 Rs. The Russian ruble, the Brazilian real, the South African rand, the Chinese renminbi, and the Indian rupee. So that has already started. It's not a new process, but the idea of the BRICS cross-border payment initiative is being able to connect the different payment systems of these countries and to connect the banks, the correspondent banks. So for people who don't know, the way that a lot of cross-border payments work today in the US-dominated financial system is banks in different countries, they communicate through what they call a correspondent bank. So as an example, until a few years ago, let's say if Indonesia wanted to trade with Malaysia, well, if you're an exporter in Indonesia and you want to export your copper to Malaysia, the Indonesian exporter has an Indonesian bank and they want to get paid by the Malaysian importer. The Malaysian importer has a Malaysian bank. How does it communicate with the Indonesian bank? Well, depending on the banks, I don't know about this case of Indonesian, Malaysia, it's just an example, right? But the point is that usually what happens is that the Malaysian bank will not have any direct link to the Indonesian bank because they're just small national banks. But they will have a link to a big bank like in New York, like Bank of America or Goldman Sachs or something, right? One of these huge mega banks. So both of these banks, their correspondent bank goes through the US financial system, usually. So the Malaysian importer will send the payment to Bank of America, which will process the payment, and then they'll send that payment to the Indonesian bank used by the Indonesian exporter, right? This is how the system works for most countries. It's obviously, one, extremely inefficient, very slow, and the correspondent bank, usually located in the US, sometimes in the UK, they charge a fee for this, right? So they're profiting from this. The banks in different countries are losing money from this. It's very slow, it's very inefficient, and there's political risk because most of these transactions technically go through digitally the US banking system. The U.S. claims that they touch U.S. soil, in scare quotes, therefore that all these banks that rely on U.S. correspondent banks must abide by U.S. sanctions policy. So that means that it makes it very difficult for these countries that are sanctioned to trade with each other. So the point is that BRICS is trying to simplify all of that process and say, why the hell are we using all these correspondent banks in the US or in London? We should create our own network. So this is a little different from the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which is also something that was discussed in the BRICS Summit and in this report that was published by the chair of BRICS, Russia, this year, by the Russian Finance Ministry and Central Bank. So I mentioned the cross-border payment initiative. To supplement that, they're also talking about trying to develop an alternative to the SWIFT interbank messaging system. And there are already alternatives that exist. Russia has its own system. China has its own system. So they're trying to integrate these different systems. So what is SWIFT? This is the financial messaging network, the platform used. So even if you don't have the correspondent banks located in New York or London, if you're still using the SWIFT messaging infrastructure, the US can try to sanction you and cut off your banks from SWIFT, which is what the US did to Russian banks. So those are two related issues that are technically separate, but they're related. And those are issues that BRICS is working on. Another very interesting issue that BRICS is working on is experimenting with new technologies, including what they call a distributed ledger technology, DLT, which is blockchain is the most famous example, right? It's similar to like P2P, right? Like torrents. So instead of having information centralized in one place, all of the information is decentralized and located all across different nodes in the network. So the idea of using distributed ledger technology for cross-border payments and for, in particular, using central bank digital currencies for transactions is that they can settle trade imbalances through their central banks, and all of the information from these transactions is located on a decentralized ledger. So this is ledger technology. So this technology has already been experimented with. It exists. There are two famous programs. One involving China is called the mBridge platform. This involves mainland China, Hong Kong, which has a separate monetary authority. It also involves Thailand and the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia recently joined. So the advantage of this is that, say, the U.S. goes even crazier and puts full sanctions on China like it has on Russia. This would make it difficult for China to import oil and natural gas from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. China is the world's largest importer of oil, and it's the biggest purchaser of oil and natural gas from the Gulf countries. Not the U.S., which actually is now one of the world's top 3 oil producers. That's a big change in the past decade because of the shale revolution in the U.S. oil industry and very low interest rates, and the U.S. just giving all this free money basically to the oil industry. So anyway, the point is that if there's this crisis, if the U.S. tries to cut off Chinese banks, how can China pay for the import of oil and gas from Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Well, it created this new platform, mBridge, in which these transactions can be settled directly between the central banks of China and the UAE and Saudi, right? And Saudi and the UAE, they also have state-owned oil and gas companies. And China, much of its economy is still state-owned as well. So they can use central bank digital currencies. They don't need any other currency. They don't need the SWIFT system. They can directly communicate between their central banks and settle these trade imbalances. And this is happening. I mean, it's still in the early stages, but it already exists. And Saudi Arabia has said that it's interested in selling oil to China in renminbi. And the UAE has already sold liquefied natural gas to China in renminbi as well. So those are the main things that were discussed. They were included in this report published by Russia as the chairman of BRICS this year. And one other very important thing about this is that they're also really trying to encourage investment within BRICS. So one of the things that they pointed out is that a lot of poor countries, developing countries, a lot of their capital ends up flowing out to the rich capitalist countries in the West, right? The imperialist countries. They don't need more capital. They're not capital scarce. They have a lot of capital. So what happens is that economists have shown that there's this net drain of wealth where the poorest 80% of countries end up sending capital to the richest 20% of countries, and they have net capital income in the 20% richest countries representing over 1% of GDP, and you have a net drain. You have a drain of net capital income from out of the poorest 80% representing 2 to 4% of GDP. So what does that mean in less technical terms? It means that the poorer countries are helping to make the rich countries richer. The rich countries are draining wealth from the poor countries. And BRICS is saying this is obviously unfair, and we need to find ways to encourage capital to stay within the developing countries because they are capital scarce. So they need this capital to industrialize, to build factories, to build infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads. So BRICS is also trying to create new opportunities for investment in the BRICS countries and in other developing countries. So I have made the argument that I really think that what BRICS is doing is very much in the vein of the call for a new international economic order. This is what the formerly colonized countries famously called for 50 years ago in 1974. And these were countries that were part of the G77, the group of 77, which has now expanded. There are now 134 countries involved, which is, the global majority. The G7 is the 10% of the imperialist countries. The global majority is represented by the G77. And they, for 50 years now, this is the 50th anniversary, they've called for a new international economic order, recognizing that the global monetary and financial system is dominated by the Western powers and benefits them at the expense of the global South, the global majority. So I think BRICS is really finally helping to realize this vision that has been demanded for decades, even going back to the Bandung Conference of 1955 and the non-aligned movement. And I think that's why I wrote in an article that on the 50th anniversary, seeing this historic summit in Kazan, Russia, where many of these ideas were put into writing and they were agreed to by the BRICS members of transforming the global monetary and financial system. I think this is it's a realization of the dream of so many developing countries, formerly colonized countries for decades, of their call for a new international economic order. And, as the famous quote says, nothing is as powerful as a good idea whose time has come.
Oh, for sure. And we can, close on this last comment to you, Ben, but I'll just say that one of the things that I notice is in all the talks about de-dollarization, it seems to me that a lot of investors, a lot of these kind of media investor types, they get really worried about de-dollarization because they think it's going to destroy the world economy and it'll, be bad for the West. But I think what BRICS is actually doing is more so in the positive, in that any kind of discussion about currency and an alternative kind of economic structure around it is really geared toward what China and to an extent Russia and now the entirety of BRICS, what they're trying to do is they're focusing on development, which, yes, currency is a medium of exchange facilitating development, but development itself is much bigger than that. And those numbers about wealth and how wealth is siphoned from the poorest of nations, the most oppressive nations, to those who are doing the siphoning and the oppressing. That is really what BRICS, in my estimation, is trying to resolve. And you don't even have to look at the intricacies and the thought and what's happening in these discussions to even understand this, at least at a surface level. You can just look at who is participating, who is championing this, how is it being championed, and what ideas are being spread. How does something like you've talked about in the past on this show is how does the new development bank, how does this bank behave? Who's leading it? Right? All of this just shows who are these 13 partner countries that we've discussed. I mean, they all have very similar backgrounds, common bonds and links that are economic, political, and it does point to, as you said, Ben, this attempt to create a new international economic order that is actually just and that is driven and led by those who have been stripped of any kind of ability to determine their destiny. And I've heard this about the UN, and we can talk about all these other institutions as well internationally, which kind of go hand in hand with the financial institutions globally that facilitate the current economic order, the unipolar order of Western dominated imperialism. I mean, that seems to me to be where BRICS, Russia, China led, but also just now all of these countries joining, they are seemingly trying to work out whatever differences they have, whatever issues that they may have between each other, whatever relationships may be different economically and politically. They're trying to come together and find common denominators to get out of the situation that the world has been in for so long. So, Ben, final comments on this?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Danny. I mean, what is BRICS ultimately after? Development. And this is made very clear in the statement, the Kazan Declaration that they published together. They want economic development. And Bolivia has now been invited as a partner country. And Bolivia's president, Luis Arce, who's a leftist economist, he said very clearly in his speech that we are fighting against imperialism, neocolonialism. We are fighting for our sovereignty, and we want to reduce global inequality and redistribute wealth. And when he says that, he's saying from the rich colonialist countries that got rich through pillaging their colonies to the global majority. He's saying that this disparity is unjust and it must be changed. And in fact, what I'd like to conclude with is your comments reminded me of a very famous quote. If I can share my screen here really quickly, I want to show. You said something that reminded me of this. You can see my screen, right? Can you?
Yes, I can. I cannot. Oh, I can add it. Let me add it for you.
Yeah.
Here we go. Boom.
So your comments reminded me, and this discussion of BRICS and Bolivia's president Arce calling for a global redistribution of wealth from the rich countries to the poor ones. That the rich ones, of course, got rich by pillaging the poor ones. It reminded me of this famous cable from 1948 by the notorious U.S. State Department official George Kennan, who was an architect of the first Cold War. And in 1948, this is on the Office of the Historian website for the State Department, he had this famous quote. And this to me says everything about U.S. foreign policy, what motivates U.S. foreign policy. He noted that we have about 50% of the world's wealth. This is in 48, right? So this is right after World War II. The biggest economies were destroyed in World War II, whereas the U.S., not only was its economy not destroyed physically, the assets were not destroyed by the war, the factories were not destroyed, but actually the U.S. economy grew very rapidly because it was making all of this ammunition and weapons and tanks for World War II. So at this time, the U.S. is nearly half of global GDP. So he said, George Kennan said, we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. So he's saying that, people in Asia, they envy us because we're really rich and they're poor. Right. So he says, what is the goal of the U.S. government? He says, quote, our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. This, if you want one line that summarizes U.S. foreign policy in the past century, this is it. The U.S. goal is to devise a pattern of relationships that will permit us to maintain a position of economic disparity with the rest of the world. So the U.S. can be the banker of the world. It can print a bunch of dollars and then export its inflation around the world, sell the rest of the world its debt, and import the value produced by workers around the world. So workers in the global south have to break their backs mining. They have to break their backs in factories, creating manufactured products. They sell that to the U.S. The U.S. gives them dollars, which it prints. It doesn't have to do anything. It's as my friend Aaron Good says, Rumpelstiltskin. I mean, the U.S. just makes the dollars out of nothing. And then it benefits from being the so-called richest country on earth, which obviously we know it's not. We see it increasing homelessness, poverty, brutality, state violence. But a small handful of capitalist oligarchs have gotten very, 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 very rich. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they've gotten very rich from this, right? And a small handful of elites in other countries who they get rich in their local country and then they stash their money offshore in dollar denominated assets. They buy US real estate, they buy US stocks and bonds, they hide their wealth in the Virgin Islands and these tax shelters. That system has benefited the oligarchs in the West, a small handful of oligarchs in the global South, at the expense of the vast majority of humanity. And what BRICS is saying is we need a new system. And not every country in BRICS agrees about what that system will look like, but what they do agree with is that that system has to change. And I think that's why I keep saying that, in the Western media, you see these reports saying that BRICS has failed. France 24, French state media, they said BRICS has failed to transform the global financial system. And what I always say is you have no idea. They are just getting started. This is the beginning.
Totally. It really is just the beginning, and that beginning already feels so momentous. I was just thinking back on your comments about India and the economic roots of why it would want to, at the very least, begin the process of Asia Times says, pivoting more toward China. Not really a pivot, but I think that's an exaggeration, but to actually begin opening up a real relationship and talks again about such important issues like their border dispute. Because even in the Asia Times, they are talking about how India gambled a lot on the US economy, on the United States, providing it the capacity to develop. And what happened? The exact opposite actually happened. The exact opposite. They had all these lofty dreams of increasing their value-added manufacturing. It didn't happen. They thought they were going to get help producing these iPhones and being able to distribute them and compete with China's tech industry and all of this. No, nothing of the sort is happening. Actually, during COVID-19 and onward, a lot of these corporations began to close up shop and say, well, this isn't beneficial to us. We don't have the money. We don't want to invest. We don't want to dump the capital here to make it happen. And so India's CEOs and executives and investors themselves are probably putting a lot of pressure on the Indian government to do this. So all of this is to say is, and you brought up the 1948 quote, what a time that was. What a time that was, where the U.S. was sitting pretty with was able to leverage World War II for its own economic development. And isn't it so interesting, Ben, how now we've kind of come full circle? A lot of these fears of World War III or a global conflagration of a new kind coming, but yet the overall trend is that the countries that have benefited the least and have been exploited the most, you're sitting in one of them, once was one of them in China. Now they seem to be the ones that are on the up and up. They're the ones who are somehow able to leverage this very challenging moment geopolitically and economically to better themselves, improve their development, to raise the standard of living, and also to maintain and strengthen their sovereignty and build mechanisms like BRICS. And I think that is such a historic achievement given just where we were not even a century ago. I mean, we're talking a matter of 80 or so years, not even. So that is, I think that is a historic achievement given where still the global South is in development terms. It is something to behold indeed. But any final last words before we close up here, Ben?
No, I think you said it very well. I mean, I think we should understand BRICS in the context of the Bandung Conference of 1955, right? People say, what is BRICS? There's so much confusion. Even some people who support BRICS, I think, sometimes kind of misunderstand it. So President Putin made it very clear before the summit in Kazan that we're not a military bloc. We're never going to be a military bloc. BRICS is not the global South NATO. No, BRICS is, I see it as a platform for the developing countries of the world, which include the global South, but also Russia, which was partially colonized in the 90s, right? With the overthrow of the Soviet Union, we saw that, U.S. neoliberal economists came in and oversaw mass privatizations, looting. The neoliberal shock therapy that was imposed on the former Soviet Union led to millions of excess deaths. UNICEF reported, UNICEF, the UN Child's Fund, I mean, this is not in any way a radical group. They reported that 3 million Russians died. There were excess deaths because of, just in Russia, because of the neoliberal shock therapy. I mean, this was a horrific economic crisis that made the, Great Depression seem like peaceful, right? In Russia in the 90s. So having gone through that period, now Russia has economically risen again and is trying to exert sovereignty and defend its own unique political system and not be controlled once again by the West. So despite the fact that Russia is not part of the global South, in spirit, it's part of this movement of developing countries, formerly colonized countries, that have come together based on their common interest in economic development and creating a new financial architecture that benefits them. And they said it very clearly. We're not, as an organization, aimed against the West. That's not the goal. The goal is to provide more opportunities economically for ourselves to develop. And if the West sees that as anti-West, well, that reflects the Western view, which is a unipolar view of the world, that we should dominate everything, a hegemonic view that you cannot benefit unless we benefit, right? I mean, that's the zero-sum view. We have to benefit. Whereas the perspective put forward by China is we can have mutual benefit for win-win cooperation. And this is the kind of spirit that we can see back in the Bandung Conference in 1955. If you go back and study that history, there were a lot of political differences. Believe me, there were many political differences at the Bandung Conference. There were more radical revolutionary forces, and there were more bourgeois nationalist forces who were against colonialism, but they didn't really want to rock the boat of, the economy very much. They were, still diehard capitalists. But the point is that despite their political and economic differences, they came together in their mutual opposition to colonialism. And then you have the creation of the non-aligned movement in the 60s. And then the group, the G77, right? So I think BRICS very much kind of follows in that same historical trajectory. But now there's a big difference. Russia is part of it. Whereas, of course, in the Cold War, the Soviet Union had its own bloc. But now we see that Russia is part of this global South-led attempt to create a new economic architecture. And I think this is, for the global majority, this is very positive.
Yeah. And there are times I've tried to imagine what it must have been like in the former Soviet Union and Russia during the shock therapy period, when life expectancy was going down for certain sectors of the population, like men, about 1 year for every year past. That truly is, I mean, for lack of a better term, like a shocking development in the modern capitalist imperialist era, where the so-called tenets of capitalism are supposed to be, at the very least, to preserve labor so you can exploit labor. Doesn't mean your life is basically going to go up. Doesn't mean that's going to go up very much. Doesn't mean you're going to be living good, but it does mean you'll exist. But literally in Russia, people were dying a year. They were losing a year of life expectancy for every year that was passing for a good 5 to 10 years. I mean, just absolutely. I can't even imagine what that actually is like. Is, I think, pretty instructive to why Russia has changed quite dramatically since that period. But lastly, before we go, people have been saying that Iran is releasing video footage of their air defense systems intercepting Israeli strikes. So it's quite clear that there was activity, but that activity was indeed in large part thwarted. And we'll have to see how extensive actually that operation was. But in any event, we can close here. I want to thank everyone for all of the super chats. I put them up on the screen, as many as I could. I didn't put up more than one from one person, but I do appreciate all of you for the very generous super chats tonight. I also want to thank all the moderators, of course. I want to point you to the video description where you can find Geopolitical Economy Report on YouTube. Be sure to follow all of Ben's videos. He also has a website, which you can find on his YouTube channel as well. Ben, anything else you'd like to say?
No, just everyone can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com. All the links are there. And keep up the great work, Danny. I love your channel, and it's always a great pleasure collaborating. So keep it up.
Of course, we'll do more. And everyone, go to the video description, find Ben's work, and you can find all the places to support here, Patreon, Substack, and much more. Thank you to all the folks on Rumble who watched tonight on this Friday evening here in the US. And thanks to Ben, of course, for joining on a Saturday morning in Beijing. With all that said, everyone, I will see you again soon. Be sure to hit the notifications bell and to subscribe here so you can see when I am back. But with all that said, everyone, good night and take care. And I'll see you again soon. All right, here we go.